Because she doesn't care.
How are we all doing today? Doing good. All right, ready for the weekend? Is anybody doing a Vita shift this weekend? I'm doing a Vita shift this weekend, so
What time slot in?
I'll be there at 11. I'm doing assembling, so I'm actually going to training right after this because it's been a long time since I've done physical assembly of tax forms. I usually just kind of TurboTax. Probably not something I should admit, but it's just like, it's so easy and just gets things done so quickly. Yeah, Dr. Keys will be just kind of recoiling the horse. Says, "Are you calling yourself a CPA?" I says, "Yeah, I do. I do." Yeah. So you may notice my voice is still kind of on the amend. I've basically on Tuesday I was not feeling great, but I thought everything was okay. I tried to go to sleep and I just could not sleep. Then I woke up and I could not talk. And I was like, this is not bode well for a lecturer. It's one of those things, the voice. So normally, even if I'm going to be sick and not on campus, I would do a live remote thing. But I thought, yeah, that's probably not going to work when I can't actually talk. So that's why you all got to watch the video, and hopefully that went okay. Did anybody just turn off and discuss when I started trash talking the AIS class? It was actually pretty mild if you shocked on it. It was just the AIS class was kind of moderately responsive to my questions. To be honest, I trash talk the graduate students a lot more than I thought trash talk the AIS students. And it's amazing how many times I have to do that to the graduate class. I have to call them out for their actions. We had an interesting day today where they were struggling with the concepts of tracing and vouching, and I'm like, this is 417 stuff, guys. But out of curiosity, what was going on in Demir's class today? Was that an exam going on over there? Oh, quiz. Okay.
But was it here?
Okay. I saw it was a Pendra handing out this stuff. Yeah. So I was trying to figure out what was going on, and I was telling my graduate students, I really wish I got a hold of the quiz. I would have just randomly yelled stuff out in the background, like the answers and the questions. I wouldn't have given you the correct answers. I would have just randomly answered you around.
One question, so I don't think you have so many answers.
I don't know. It just, if I can sabotage my faculty peers, I mean, if I can't call them friends, if they can't call me friends for that, am I really doing my job? So, anyway, just as a reminder, we still have to set up groups for the presentation at the end of the semester. I have not yet got any group requests, so I would like to make sure you think about that and let me know if you have any requests for people you'd like to be in a group with. I'm going to finalize these before spring break, so we've got basically, well, a week and a half roughly. The reason I say a week and a half is I'm going to do my annual tradition of we'll have off Friday before spring break. I can't say that you'll have off Friday from your other classes, but we will not be meeting on Friday here. That's assuming all goes well. If anybody infuriates me and I say that we have to have class on Fridays, then I'll hold that as punitive leverage. But I've never done it before, so it's probably an empty threat. So yeah, plan is that we've got next week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then week 8, Monday, Wednesday, and you all can go off your merry way and enjoy spring break. All right, let's go ahead and get to the homework, shall we? So let's go back in track of things and make sure we get everything. By the way, I was really sad that I didn't get to talk about SUSAC Day, but again, I always look forward to that conversation. But Rita Crenwell today, she's just about as fascinating. And so that's actually a case that in my forensics class we do at the very beginning of the class now. So there's a lot of different dimensions you can take with that. Anyway, question 612. An auditor's primary consideration regarding an entity's internal controls is whether they what? So you may say, look at this question and say, we didn't talk about that. I'm not really sure what the question is. And the answer is we absolutely did talk about it. It's not necessarily framed from the correct the directions you might have thought. So I'm going to show you this amazing picture once again. Okay, I don't want to distract everybody from the task at hand and then showing you this incredible piece of artwork. Okay, but I do think it's important for this. So we're going to hold this open for a few seconds, and I'm going to deprive you of it for the rest of the class period. So remember, the way we characterize controls in this course is that the risk is associated with a management assertion. The risk dictates what the control created by the client is, and that control is what we're supposed to be testing. That is how we characterize the test of controls in this course. So going back to the question, what is an auditor's primary consideration with respect to controls? Okay, thinking about the control sequence, let's go through the answer one by one. Do they prevent management override? No, that's not in the control sequence. And plus, we know that management override is necessary for proper functioning of systems. Relate to the control environment. Now, that is a consideration for sure. We know that from the COSO framework. But is that the primary consideration? Again, our auditor's consideration is going to be different than what management's consideration is. With management's philosophy operating style, again, that would be a good management consideration, maybe an organizational consideration. But again, we're talking about auditor's consideration. Affect the financial statement assertions. Well, how do we characterize risk as auditors? Management assertions. Therefore, our primary concern is can we identify the risk and determine when the controls are appropriate for those risks? Which this was a difficult question. If you got it right, kudos. If you didn't, don't feel bad. It's a way to think about these questions. It's very subjective, but that is the way that we need to approach the question. What was the auditor's concern? The auditor's primary concern is how do we characterize risk from the auditor's perspective? 613. Which of the following statements about internal control is correct? Does anybody else hate questions like this? I try not to write questions like this, but I find myself falling into it. I just don't like questions where you can't frame what it is I'm supposed to be looking for the answer whenever you're going through it. That being said, the options do make you think. So let's go through each of them. A properly maintained internal control system reasonably ensures that collusion among employees cannot occur. Is that a correct statement? What do we know about collusion in internal controls? Yeah, it's the way to get around internal controls. It's an inherent limitation. So we can't stop collusion. We just can basically design controls to the best of our ability. The establishment and maintenance of internal controls is an important responsibility of the internal auditor. Is that the internal auditor's responsibility? Whose responsibility is it? Management's responsibility, okay? And a sexually strong internal control system is enough for the auditor to eliminate substantive procedures on a significant account balance. So this sounds like a great idea. Controls are so effective that we don't have to do any substantive testing. Is that a true statement? No, it's not a true statement. And one of the big reasons why is when we talk about controls are almost exclusively, not entirely exclusively, but almost exclusively related to transactions and events. What is the other category of assertions we're concerned about as auditors? Account balances, okay? So that's going to be something we need to cover at least to some degree. Now, can we reduce substantive testing through good internal controls? Yeah, that's the goal, but we cannot eliminate substantive testing. So it must be D. Cost-benefit relationship is a primary criterion that should be considered in designing an internal control system. Whoa, that's like something we learned in AIS. Remember that cost-benefit framework we talked about, SFAC number 8? It hasn't gone away. So if we're going to create controls, we want to make sure the controls actually provide value to us. Doesn't make sense to have a control that costs $1 million to operate that saves you $10 a year. So yeah, it's a bad control. It's a bad control in that case. You know, see me pausing and drinking all the time. My voice is still pretty rough. Monitoring is a major component of the COSO internal control integrated framework, which the following is not correct in how the company implemented monitoring. So this one may have required a little bit of research, but this is kind of an interesting point. So again, what is monitoring? What is the goal of monitoring? That's to make sure that if risks change, the company properly updates and assesses those risks and modifies controls as needed. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. So let's just go through the answers again. Monitoring can be an ongoing process. Sound reasonable? Yeah, and it's true. Okay, we can actually have continuous monitoring. That's something that's pretty common in organizations. Monitoring can be done as a separate evaluation. So instead of being continuous, we could do this separately as well. Yeah, those are both correct statements. Monitoring and other audit work conducted by internal audit staff can reduce external audit costs. Is that a correct statement? That is, in fact, a correct statement. We know that the internal audit work and the work the company conducts with respect to controls can actually reduce our work and not reduce our cost. The independent auditor can serve as part of the entity's control environment and continuous monitoring. So if you are part of the control environment and you do monitoring for your client, when you go to that point where you're testing controls, whose work are you testing? You're testing your own work. All right, you're testing your own work. Now, does that sound like a great idea? It'd be like saying you can grade your own exams. Like I'd have so many 100%. It'd be amazing. So I didn't really miss that question. I meant to circle this one and do that like 15 times. Yeah. So yeah, that's generally not an accepted approach. It's not going to be an accepted approach for auditors. We cannot test our own work. So D is our answer. By the way, these were all not intentionally D. It just kind of happenstance. Regarding the assessed level of control risk, an auditor would perform somewhat, okay? So what does this mean? So assess level of control risk is our preliminary assessment. That's where we think we're going to assess control risk. Now, if I set control risk at high, what does that tell you about my requirement to test controls? I am not necessarily required to test controls if I set control risk high. Remember we talked about that substantive strategy. If I say, look, control risk is high, my testing is going to be a waste of time. I'm just not going to test controls, right? So that's saying if we, regardless of whether we set this at high or low, and then if we're talking about low, are we required to test controls if it's at moderate or low? Yes. If we set it anything below high, we are required to test controls. So you need to actually determine this is something that's going to occur regardless of whether we test controls or not. So part perform some test of controls determines the vectors of controls. We know that's not correct, okay? Because we know that only test controls are required if we do a reliance strategy, which sets a control risk below high. Analytical procedures to verify the design of controls. Do analytical procedures verify design of controls? No, they're completely separate concepts. Analytical procedures and testing the design of controls, they do not overlap. Remember, analytical procedures are not a test of controls. We can't use them to verify the design of controls. The statement is incorrect in any context because those are not relevant. Substantive procedures to restrict detection risks for significant transaction classes. Are we going to perform some substantive procedures regardless of how many test of controls we perform? Yes, absolutely. C is our answer. But dual purpose test to evaluate the risk of monetary misstatement and preliminary control risk. What is a dual purpose test again? We talked about this earlier. So dual purpose test is a series of tests that can be modified to perform both test of controls and substantive procedures simultaneously. They are generally not the same test, but they cover the same area of testing. So that's why we call them dual purpose tests. Now we don't have to perform dual purpose tests because we're not required to perform test of controls, but we are always required to perform substantive procedures, which is why C is our correct answer. It's getting warm in here. I see the sleepy eyes going in. They turn the heat up when it gets cold outside. That's how you can tell. All right. I'm going to try to make it more exciting for you. Very, very hard. We're talking about internal controls. Which of the following audit techniques would most likely provide an auditor with the least assurance about the effectiveness of operation control? Boy, that wording is just terrible, isn't it? Yeah, it's like somebody was trying to figure out, oh, most likely, at least assured. I don't know what I'm going on. So yeah, I hate the questions. Plus, I hate the answers here because there's two possible correct answers here. Did anybody look at this and say, I'm not sure which is correct? So basically, which provides the least amount of assurance is the way we're going to answer this question. What do we know about the lowest reliability of tests? What are those called? Observation and inquiry. Yeah. So least reliable test, least assurance. So those are both listed here. The book says inquiry because they say it's more likely that you're going to lie about something and people are going to change their behavior, but I would not try to disseminate that. If I gave you this question on the exam, I would count either one correct, which probably tells you I'm not going to give you this question. All right. But if you said inquiry or observation, I would consider both of those correct because those are both low reliability tests. All right. SOC 1 Type 2 reports issued by the service organization's auditor typically do what? So there's a brief blurb about SOC 1 reports. So keep in mind that there are 5 different categories of system and organization control reports. We're only concerned about one category. Those are the SOC 1 reports. So SOC 1 specifically relates to internal controls of our financial reporting, and there are 2 categories. Type 1 basically says we want to evaluate the design of controls at a point in time. Type 2 says we want to evaluate both design and operating effectiveness for a period of time. And just as a reminder from the lecture that you all had to watch, which one provides more assurance, Type 1 or Type 2? Type 2. As I say, if you throw out a guess, it's basically 50% chance, but you got that one right. So Type 2, all right. So let's go through the answers. Provide reasonable assurance that financial statements are free from material misstatement. Is that true? No, they're just giving an assessment of controls. They're not actually looking at financial statements. Ensure the entity will not have any misstatements and errors related to service organization's activities. No, again, that's more substantive in nature. Ensure the entity is billed correctly. They probably do care about billing, but that's not what we're talking about with respect to SOC reports. Assess whether the service organization's controls are suitably designed and operating effectively. What do we have there? Is that a winner? Yeah, I hope so. It's the last one we have. So it's the last one we have. All right. Moving forward. How'd you do a problem here, which I think is kind of a valuable line. Cook CPA has been engaged to audit the financial statements of General Department Stores Incorporated, the Jimmy auditing entity, to a chain of medium-sized retail stores. General's financial year will end on June 30th, 2024, and General's management has asked Cook to issue the auditor's report by August 1st, 2024. Cook will not have sufficient time to perform all the necessary field work in July 2024, but will have time to perform most of the field work at interim date, April 30th, 2024. So after the accounts are tested and date, Cook will also perform substantive procedures covering the transactions for the final 2 months of the year. This will be necessary to extend Cook's conclusions to the balance sheet date. Is that a legitimate thing to do? So we know that we can test internal controls at interim date. Can we do some substantive testing at interim date as well? Did talk about this in the video. I actually looked this up. The answer is yes, we can do that too. We can do that as well. Now there's some caveats to that, but we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Okay. So describe the factors Cook should consider before applying substantive procedures to general balance sheet accounts on April 30th, 2024. So the primary consideration is a pretty obvious one. What do we know about the sequence of test work in auditing? What do we know? So we got our phases of the audit. What's our first phase of the audit? So planning technically, and then we move on to risk assessment. Risk assessment is that phase of planning. So that's our first testing phase, but our first phases. First testing is going to be risk assessment. What occurs right after risk assessment? Test of controls, yeah, what we're talking about in this chapter. And then what's after test of controls? Substantive procedures. Now, this is sequential for a reason because test of controls gives us information about the nature of our substantive procedures. We're wanting to apply substantive procedures at interim date. So what does that tell us about test of controls? Yeah, we probably want to complete most, if not all of these test of controls before we consider how we're going to apply substantive procedures at interim date. That's the first caveat there. Secondly, let's talk a little bit about the nature of substantive procedures at interim date. I said that they were possible, but how does they work? How do we consider those? What is the big problem with doing substantive procedures at an interim date? Now, just as a reminder, when we say the word interim, what does that mean? It means before the year is completed, before the period is completed. So interim date would be April 30th. They have not done all their transactions for the year as of April 30th. They've still got 2 months of transactions to go through. Now, what do we know about the assurance or the detail of doing something at interim date versus a period end date?
Less assurance.
Yeah, right, less assurance. Because the example I gave in the video is that let's say we do one exam. I do one exam in the middle of the semester or one exam at the end of the semester. Which one's going to better test your knowledge about the entire course? The one at the end of the semester. All right. Now, thankfully, I don't do just one exam. I think everybody'd be very, very miserable if I did that. Okay. But yeah, we split it up as kind of an interim idea is that I'm going to check testing so that we can actually split out the work over time. Now, when we think about that, if we know that substantive procedures are less effective as of period end, what do we need to plan, or sorry, as of interim date, what do we need to plan on doing at period end to make up for that? Would it be sensible to say that we perform some substantive procedures at interim and then the remainder at period end to make up for it? In other words, would it be possible for me to say I'm going to conduct all of my substantive procedures at interim? What's the problem with saying that, making that statement?
Run concur after.
Yeah, so the concur after. We've still got transactions that go untested. How satisfied would you be as a client that says, well, I tested 10/12 of the year. I don't think anything happened in the last 2 months. You know, fraud definitely doesn't occur right at period end. That's never been traditionally when it happens, okay? Never would happen. No, there would be a problem with that. So we'd have to make sure that we cover those last 2 months, which is what's being said in this statement. So going to part B, for accounts tested April 30th, 2024, how should the Cook design substantive procedures covering the balances of June 30th, 2024, and the transactions of the final 2 months of the year? This is fairly intuitive, all right? So I do want to talk about the substantive procedures, but I also want to talk about test of controls because these are relevant as well. So substantive procedures, let's say that I perform 10/12 of my testing because I'm going to test them at April 30th. What percentage of my testing am I going to be looking at, or what proportion of my testing am I looking at for year end? Probably the remaining 2/12, so the remaining 1/6. Okay. Now, is there a way that we could categorize this more effectively? Let's say that I have a sample size of 120 items. Could I use 100 of those at interim and then 20 of those at year end? Yes, that's a feasible approach. That's a practical approach because we're trying to look at quantity. We know that those last 2 months the last 20 would have to come from the last 2 months exclusively, but the testing would be effective in that regard. So from a quantitative perspective, it makes sense. We just use a proportional analysis. Just real quick, let's assume that we also test controls at interim date. What's the advantage of testing controls at interim date? Do we expect controls to change substantially from the middle of the year till the end of the year? No, controls are meant to be continuous and ongoing. At least most controls are. There are a few exceptions to those. So is it good enough for us to say we tested it halfway through the year, we can ignore them for the rest of the year? No, that's going to be something that comes up a couple times throughout the semester. So we're going to say, we do need to do follow-up work to make sure that the controls are still operating effectively year in. These are not going to be as extensive tests as what we did for our interim testing, but they still need to take place. That's something that we'll talk a little bit about in chapter 7 when we go through our little walkthrough in chapter 7 this coming Monday. So yeah, important to keep that in mind as well. All right. Talk about Dixon, Illinois. All right, on February 14th, 2013, Valentine's Day, Rita Crundwell was sentenced to 19 and a half years in prison for diverting $53 million of city funds for her own benefit. It's actually 53.7 million. They rounded down. That's just a tragedy. I mean, it's just 0.7 million. Who cares? $700,000. So she was in Dixon, Illinois, and Dixon, Illinois has a population of about 16,000. It's roughly the size of Kirksville. So 20 years, she managed to steal $53.7 million. So some very interesting stuff here for that. So some interesting facts about this. This is not relevant to the case, but I'd just like to share some of this. So Rita Crundwell was actually released from prison as part of the CARES Act in 2021. Does anybody know what the CARES Act is? So the CARES Act basically took prisoners who had existing health issues and were susceptible to the risk of COVID and released them to house arrest. And she was an older individual, so that's why she got released. So that seems, is anybody just really riled up about that? Or are you just kind of like, okay, that's legit? Or he's like 53.7 million, she should stay in jail. Is anybody riled up about that? If that doesn't rally you up, I will rally you up, okay? So does anybody know what a president does pretty close to the end of their term, what they often do? They do a lot of pardons, okay? And so President Biden pardoned 1,000 individuals roughly at the end of his term. Does anybody know who one of those individuals was? Rita Crundwell. She is completely pardoned for her crimes. Yes, okay. Because basically she's shown a pattern of rehabilitation during her incarceration. That was the justification given. I know President Biden didn't specifically look at this case and say, Rita Crundwell seems like an uptight individual. Who can blame anybody for stealing $54 million? I know that wasn't the case. But yeah, it's still, now is anybody a little bit annoyed, a little bit miffed? It's like, yeah, I'm a little bit annoyed, a little bit
I guess how old is she? And I doubt she's ever going to be given a position like that again.
No, she's still in pretty rough shape. Yeah, she's still in pretty rough shape, but yes, she's last I heard, she was living on her brother's ranch, which is kind of in the Dixon area, and her brother is a very interesting individual. There was a TV show called Scam Goddess, which was on Hulu for a while, and I don't remember the name of the individual, but she talked about famous frauds, and this was the very first episode of that TV show. And so there was an interview, or tried to be an interview with Rita Crundwell's brother, and say, hey, we want to know what's going on with your sister. Why is she living there? And he dropped so many expletives in that interview. It was unbelievable. So yeah, but let's talk a little bit about Rita Crundwell. So she was the go-to. She was the individual, the high authority when it comes to Dixon, Illinois. She knew what was going on. She handled all the finances for the city of Dixon. Does anybody think that's okay? That's certainly problematic, but we'll talk about why. So she participated in budget meetings, and she had voiced the need for Dixon to make spending cuts due to a lack of sufficient funds. So one of her biggest times that she was committing fraud. So just for context, when we talk about fraud from a professional's perspective, there's this idea of escalation and perpetuation. So escalation says that frauds will naturally increase over time. Perpetuation means that people who commit frauds have a sustained need to commit frauds. So that's something you will hear talk about, and for any of those in the MAC program, you'll hear me talk about that all the time in forensics. But Rita Crundwell, in her first year of the fraud, which was back in mid-90s, she stole, I think it was 91, she stole $181,000, right? And if you do the math, 20 years times 181,000 does not equal $54 million. She was up to about 5 million per year in the later years of her fraud. And this is, mind you, the same time that the global financial subprime housing crisis was going on, and it was basically wrecking the economy. She was stealing $5 million from Dixon, Illinois. But anyway, The process was not extremely complicated. According to the indictment, she opened an account at Fifth Third Bank and the name of Dixon and RSCDA, Reserve Source Capital Development Account. And it appeared to be for the benefit of City Dixon, but she was the only signatory and the only person who wrote checks in that account. So she actually had to pay the funds payable to treasurer. Now, this is interesting. Just talking not even as auditors, but just as rational human beings. If you're a bank teller and somebody comes up to you with a check signed to treasurer for $100,000, are you going to try to investigate that a little bit more thoroughly? I know it's easy to say in hindsight is 2020, but come on, if I'm at the bank, I said, whoa, treasurer for $100,000?
When you're looking at the treasurer.
Yeah.
Are you the treasurer? Like, you don't even like, there's not even proof that she's the treasurer. Like, that's the crazy part. That could just be somebody's title scribbled on there, just handing it over.
So yeah, that's certainly problematic. But anyway, so interesting stuff going on here. And by the way, they talked a little bit about Rita's background. She had a huge ranch, massive ranch with 400 show horses. She was big into showing horses. $2 million RV and jewelry, and her physician paid $80,000 for the year of time arrest. Now, that's reasonable. You could probably get by with $80,000 with a 400 show horse. Has anybody ever been involved with a ranch with horses? Like not even 400 horses, just a middle-sized ranch. And how expensive is that to run? It's ridiculous. People, there's a reason only rich people have horses. They are so expensive to maintain. 400 horses, that's millions of dollars right there. So, but she was so successful, everybody said she must be winning tons of money. It says no, she's stealing tons of money. That's the truth. So interesting story is that Rita took a lot of time off from her job. They said she was kind of traveling about 4 months out of the year for her show horse occupation. And she basically told people, do not do my job without me. So that was very, very non-fraudster type thing. Usually fraudsters have to stay in place and can't actually leave because if somebody else looks at their work, that they'll capture it. So it turns out that after about 20 years of doing this fraud, she left and said, don't do my work without me. But her assistant said, well, I've got to do some work because the budget is coming due and I've got to actually have this information. She's called the bank and said, send me all the accounts and sent them all the information about the bank accounts. And interestingly enough, there was an account that she was not familiar with. It was this RSCDA account. And it turns out that came up. And yeah, so they found the fraud and the FBI got involved and Rita Crunwell went to prison for not nearly enough time. And then it all broke down. So interestingly enough, this is going to be interesting about what's going on with the auditor. So this is an audit of a small town. How seriously do you think CLA, Clifton Arts and Allen, took this audit? This was basically, it was not pro bono, but it might as well have been the amount that they charged on it. Okay, so they did not take this audit very seriously. How do I know that CLA did not take this audit seriously? There were signs. Okay, there were signs. So let's just go ahead and take a look at one example. Let's see, where is it? Okay, it's right here. So here's an example of an invoice from the Illinois Department of Transportation that she was forging invoices for her own funding. That was kind of how the funding went. So this is the legitimate one. This is the one that Rita Crunwell forged. Can anybody notice any differences just from this distance? I mean, invoice. Illinois Department invoice. Okay.
We didn't think that.
I mean, yeah, I know Photoshop was not in its heyday back in the 1990s, but come on, you could have done a little bit better. They would try. Oh, it gets worse. It gets worse.
Sewer department.
Here it gets worse. Are you ready? Okay. Here's something that CLA might have noticed if they've even looked at the invoices. Let's go ahead and zoom in on the fake invoice. Okay. Location, local section, route, secton. There is a typo in the forged invoice. Yeah, okay. I think CLA was a little bit complicit in this, okay? By the way, in the settlement, what happened? So they only recovered about, I think it was $11 million from Rita's ranch to pay off. The bank was held liable for about $3 million. How liable do you think the auditor was held? $35 million. $35 million. So they actually had to pay a lot of what was going on with Rita's. So $35 million is actually the case. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about this at a general level. I know that so these are fun cases because it just seems like, how could they not pick this up? And this is one of those ones that's outrageous. I know it's not as simple as what we review in the class. It's very easy to sanitize environment, but on this one, you're just like, come on, guys. You gotta at least be conscious when you're doing the audit. You can't enjoy a night of all you can drink and then go off to work. It's just not a good idea. All right.
I mean, did they even go to the bank? Like,
I don't know. I don't think the CLA did any due diligence. So let's just go ahead and do it ourselves. There is one massive control deficiency that we can identify based on our knowledge that should have we can pick up that allowed the fraud to continue for such a long period of time. One of my favorite things to talk about, which, as you all know, I have a lot of favorite things to talk about, but what is that one thing that's missing in this particular situation?
Segregation of duties.
Yeah, segregation of duties is completely non-existent. So just as a reminder, what are the 3 points of segregation of duties again? Yes, custody of assets, authorization of transactions, and recording of transactions. Who had custody of the assets? Rita. Who had authorization for the movement of assets? Rita. Who recorded these transactions? Rita. Okay, so I will accept that the segregation of duties was not in place, all right? What do we know about when segregation of duties is not possible? Is it something that we can just trust that one person is going to do the right thing every single time? So this comes up a lot, especially with small government entities, comes up a lot in charities as well. What do we know about charitable organizations? They want their administrative overhead to be extremely low, correct? If you're donating to a charity, you want as much of that donation to go to the charity and not going to paying the people who administer the charity, which is fair. So it's necessary that they have small amounts of administrative cost. So segregation duty is certainly problematic. So have auditors thought of this? Do we just say, well, we don't have a solution for that problem yet. I guess we're just going to have to accept that fraud's going to occur. No, we do know that this is a problem. So what is going to be the remediating action? There should be somebody who's reviewing Rita's work. Does it look like that this was happening, that any review of her reconciliations taking place whatsoever? Did anybody actually just go to the bank and say, can you give me the bank statements for all the accounts so I can review them separately? What do we know about internal information versus external information, which is more reliable? External. So should they have just been relying on Rita's information? No, they probably should have gone to the bank and say, send me the information. It's like, wait, there's a bank account that's not being reconciled here. I'm not sure what's going on. That would have been an easy thing for the auditor to do. It seems like they were not even bothering with bank confirmations. They were just kind of saying, all right, we're going to ignore this altogether because we're not getting paid a lot for this, so we're not. So yeah, they weren't getting paid a lot for it, but they ended up paying a lot for it. Certainly problematic. Now, so that kind of gets to the speculation of why the auditors did not detect the fraud. First of all, they did not take the idea of segregation of duty seriously or any remediation for that. Secondly, there were just some very basic steps that were pretty obvious that they were not following here. Not really checking to see what type of steps are going through. The review of the reconciliations were certainly problematic. Also, there was kind of a really spurious definition of responsibilities. So what did I tell you? Rita took lots of vacation, which again is not very common for big frauds of this magnitude. But when she did go on vacation, what was the statement she made? Don't touch my work. Don't do that. You don't know what's going on, okay? Should somebody have known what's going on? Should there have been somebody in that role that said, well, I know Rita's in charge, but when she's not here, I need to at least have enough knowledge to do the work. I mean, think about it this way. If you're talking about just like a classroom, if I had to give an exam on Wednesday, would there have to have been somebody in the faculty that would have had knowledge about how to administer an exam so they could have done that? Yeah, that's kind of a base level of knowledge. That would be the base level expectation, and that was not being met. So some very simple questions that CLA should have been asking that they were not asking. Yeah, they were woefully negligent in this. And again, I think it's one of those things where an auditor says it's not worth our time to ask a lot of questions. And so, it became very much worth their time after a while. All right, last one. I actually really like this activity. It's really hard to kind of clarify what test of controls looks like. So I think they did a really nice job of this, talking about how we test controls and how we actually validate this. Now, this is an extremely simple analysis, but it does kind of cover the bases we're concerned about. Also, one of the problems with this is you will notice under the assertions, we've got existence occurrence, authorization, accuracy, existence occurrence. What do we know about authorization? Not a real assertion, okay? I do honestly think that these would be more existence occurrence, existence occurrence assertions, but I kind of ignore that. There's a reason for it, which we'll talk about in a second. I do want to kind of have those fairly consistent. But authorization, again, not a real assertion. I refuse to accept that. I refuse to accept that as a real assertion. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking at these voucher packages and you're going to be checking for 5 specific controls that were in place. Had to have certain documents, had to have a signature for the requisition, had to be a signature for the purchase order. There had to be agreement between the documents. What do we call this back in AIS, by the way? What does it say when we look at the vendor invoice and agree it with the receiving report, purchase order, and the invoice? So it's called a matching process. And back then we talked about it as the 3-way match. Well, we got 4 documents here, so what would this be called? Yeah, predictably a 4-way match, yeah. So we're actually checking to make sure they agree with one another and they're mathematically correct. All right. And then all the documents in the voucher package have been stamped paid. So let's just go ahead and walk through one example. I know you all did this already, but I want to make sure that we understand the process, and then we're going to check our answers. Sound good? Okay. So let's go ahead and check and see. Here, make sure I have my information here. Right. Okay. So it contains all documents appropriate for the transaction. So we had 4 documents that were necessary. We had the voucher package, or sorry, not the voucher package. We had the document list, the purchase request, purchase order, receiving report, and invoice. So let's just go ahead and check and see. Purchase request. So what's the purchase request again? That's where the department says, hey, we need this, and they issue official item. This is going to be approved by a separate authority. So this is where we get the purchase order. This is the document where it's actually sent to our vendor saying, we've approved this particular purchase. Can you actually facilitate this for us? Presumably the vendor was going to send us the items. So we're going to get our receiver report because we're going to receive those goods. And then once we receive those goods, they send us the invoice. Now, the invoice is an external document, okay, which is why it looks different from this. Now, this is an important point because it's going to be relevant to one of our vouchers here in just a second. But do we agree that all the items were received? Okay, good. All right. So our second one is the purchase requisition is signed by a supervisor. Which purchase requisition, purchase request, those are going to be same thing. So purchase request signed by supervisor. Sure looks like that's the case. Sure looks like we're good. All right. Purchase order is signed by an authorized purchasing agent. I like how they actually put down authorized purchasing agent just for reference. Yeah, that's thoroughness. Some of the things they can't manage, like they can't manage to actually do a good calculation of a materiality workbook, but they can definitely put down authorized purchasing agent in red ink. So very good on that. Then we actually match the documents. So the document should have been matched, and we check and make sure that those items match up. So there should have been a match on there, and then mathematically correct. That's actually the invoice. I'm sorry, not the receipt report. So all these are matching up. And then everything should have been stamped paid in that red bold. So we should have paid on there. So this first package, everything looked good, right? And that's what we would do for a series of controls checks. Now, hopefully you noted, let's just go ahead and go back here. So we had to make sure that all controls are identified as effective or deviation. And it didn't really take a long part of this process. Probably one test probably took you less than 5 minutes. Did it take anybody longer than 5 minutes to do a controls test? I don't think it was particularly difficult. Well, I had to do 4 of them, but technically speaking, we actually did 75. There were 71 additional items that were all effective. We didn't list those out though. All right, let's just check our answers here. Make sure we have everybody's answers are correct. And I'm notorious for getting these wrong, even though I've got the solutions right in front of me. So you can check, double check and make sure I get this. So our second voucher package, first control, effective or not effective? Effective, okay. Second control.
I think this one was missing.
This one's deviation. We got a deviation here, okay. What about third control? Yeah, another deviation here. What about fourth control?
This one's correct.
Effective.
And that one, the stamp was also.
So Carter's kind of volunteering all this response, but if Carter's wrong, you guys need to call him out on it, okay? All right, but I do think you are correct on that one. I do believe you're correct. In fact, I know you're correct. I got it right in front of me. All right. What do we got here for the third voucher package? First control, good, effective, yeah. Second control, that's a deviation. Yeah, deviation. Third control, good, effective. Fourth control, yeah, deviation, yeah. And fifth control. I like how the impetus is switched over to Ethan now. Yeah, so yeah, take the load off everybody. All right. So, what do we got for the first control? Or sorry, the first control in the final voucher package. Deviation. So what do we got? So that's an interesting one. It's an interesting point. You have a valid point. But why did he say deviation? Did anybody else think there was a deviation here? Everybody else said it was effective? All right. So Ethan, I agree with your assessment to a degree. I do think that there's a problem with these documents that are missing, okay? Because what does it say right up here? It doesn't say invoice, it says invoice request, okay? Now here's the interesting question. If you missed that, by the way, then lose all points for homework. No, I'm joking. So if you missed that, that's an important point to identify that was kind of given to you right up here. So invoice is not the same as the invoice request. That is not, okay? The interesting question here, though, is does this classify as a deviation? What's always our answer to every question in accounting? It really depends on what the criteria are, okay? The criteria. Should a voucher be submitted if we do not have a full invoice? If the answer to that is yes, then this is truly a deviation. Let's think about this from a little bit more of a strategic perspective, though. As I sip dramatically before I say anything. Yeah, that was mostly so I could talk. All right, who's responsible for sending this invoice? Is it our client?
Invoice request is us.
Invoice request. Who's responsible for sending the invoice? The client's vendor. Okay. If the vendor has not yet sent an invoice, is that something that we can hold the client accountable for? Like, how dare you have a vendor that won't send invoices? Just get out of my sight. No. So this is not something we can really hold accountability for. So it looks like the client has basically said, we have not received an invoice. We provided the next best details to the invoice. Now, again, if we if the client has a policy of not submitting vouchers until the full invoice has been received, this would be deviation. Is there an argument for saying this is also effective? What if it's like, okay, we're going to submit the voucher when everything's been assembled and we can't necessarily rely on the vendor to send us the invoice? So there's an argument for both of these, all right? So if you answered deviation here, you're correct. If you answered effective here, you could also be correct. If you answered effective blindly and didn't catch there's an invoice request, you're wrong, okay? But that's okay. That's okay. That's why we're here. That's why we're learning, okay? So let's just go ahead and let's assume, since we have absent information, that's ineffective, okay? It doesn't really matter, to be honest, if we classify this as a deviation or effective. That's only going to be one deviation, which is not a big issue. But go through the rest. What did you say for the second control? Effective. Third control? Effective. Fourth control? Effective. I'm answering them now. The final control? Effective. Okay. Assuming, again, that you accept that the invoice request is going to be sufficient to substitute in lieu of the invoice. That final control, you can say, we don't have the invoice as of yet, so we can't actually make an assessment. But assuming that we can accept that, we'll say it's effective. So an interesting note, if you look over here, we've got some items that have a one control deviation. Can we accept one control deviation in this testing? Yes, the specific requirement said one deviation is fine. What about two deviations? Two deviations is saying the control itself is not effective. And now we've got to reject the control. So if the control is rejected, describe the implications for the audit plan here. And so what are we going to consider when we think about the implications for the audit plan? What is our primary consideration? It was our first multiple choice question. Management assertions, okay? So we want to look at the management assertions, which if you look at this one, it's not a real management assertion, but it's authorization, all right? Now, what is the goal of authorization in this context? Why are we trying to test authorization? We're trying to make sure that people are not making purchases that are not legitimate. What do we know about most well-designed systems control? Is there usually one step for this? Or is there multiple steps to actually verify legitimacy? So you'll look and say the requisition is signed by a supervisor. We missed that on two of these. But the purchase order is also signed by an authorizing purchase agent later on. So it looks like even if this legitimate step was missed, there was a legitimacy step that took place later on. In other words, authorization occurs in multiple steps in the control process in this area. If I'm an auditor and I'm mostly concerned about the sanctity of the entire process, am I going to be reassured by the idea that authorization at least occurs through a redundant check over here as well? Yeah, and that's the whole goal here. So basically say, if this was the only step we were checking this particular assertion, which again, is not a real assertion, but if this is the only place we were concerned about proper authorization taking place, I would be really concerned about this control failure. But considering that we actually have multiple steps where authorization occurs, that's where I'm going to say, as auditors, I can bypass any concern about testing This control is a failure, but I consider this to be a minor failure, not a significant one. This is actually going to relate to what we're going to be talking about next week when we say, what is the magnitude of a control failure? You got some introduction to that for the end of the chapter 2 lecture. What does everybody remember those terms that we talked about? I shouldn't say talked about. I talked about and you listened to me talk about. Control deficiency, significant deficiency, material weakness. That's where we evaluate the magnitude, and this is going to be something that we're going to, one of the types of criteria we would consider on that is that how likely is it going to be to have an impact in the future. But in this one here, I would say authorization is checked in a subsequent control, so there's very little chance of non-authorized transactions flowing through the process, bypass further testing. Which that's always the best words you can hear is that a control fails, you still don't have to do more work. A great feeling in the world, right there, right there. All right, we're done for this week. Do some more control stuff on Monday. See y'all then.
Type of violation. That's one of the